the affirmative team is Hannah.
So psychologist Stanley Milgram wanted to test if normally kind, likeable people could be made to act against their own morals in a setting where an authoritative figure told them to do something morally wrong. He believed that the compulsion to obey enabled situations like the Nazi regime. And Milgram in 1963 stated that the inhumane acts of the Nazi regime originated from just one person, but could only have been carried out if on a massive scale if a large number of people obeyed orders. So he wanted to research to see if his participants would allow their moral judgment to be affected by a single figure of authority. The experiment took place in a laboratory in Yale University, where 40 men were selected from a wide variety of backgrounds. This included teachers, postal workers, engineers and labourers. So does this make a difference that it was only men? No. Neither Milgram nor social psychologist Tom and Blass, who in 1999 did a statistical analysis of multiple studies of obedience and found no difference in obedience rates between men and women. A fee of $4.50 was paid upon arrival, but this was common practice at the time. The participants were told they would be allowed to keep it regardless of what happened. This insinuates that participants could leave at any time, and although it would now be unethical to pay participants, if it wasn't for this study, the new ethical guidelines wouldn't be in place protecting future participants of studies. The participant was told that the learner who was working with Milgram would receive an electric shock to be administered by them if they gave an incorrect answer. The machine was fake and no shocks were actually given. When the participant was prompted to continue by the observer if they started to hesitate, and this may be called into question as unethical, as it gives the appearance that the participant was unable to leave. But again, Milgram does state that at the beginning, they could leave at any time and still be paid. All participants gave what they thought to believe was thought to be up to 300 volts, and 65% went on to give the maximum 450 volts. Milgram had not intended to cause discomfort to his participants. Before the experiment, Milgram did consult other psychologists and asked how far they thought the participants would go. They believed just 1 in 10 of 1% would go all the way, yet in reality over 50% did. There was no way Milgram could have predicted this. The careful debriefing that Milgram gave after his experiments meant that participants were given reasons for the deception and the exact purpose of the study. Milgram believes that his debriefing was instrumental in reassuring and protecting those taking part. 84% of participants were glad to have taken part, and Milgram drew attention to his survey when he was criticised regarding the benefits of participation and the accusations that he had not respected his participants sufficiently. 1 year after the study, the 40 participants were interviewed again and disclosed no information that showed emotional harm due to the study. This was a groundbreaking research, making Milgram one of the most famous psychologists of his time, and his work can be defended.
First speaker from the opposing team is Kyle.
2 seconds. Right, okay, so we've got the setup. So you arrive at a big university building, you're ushered into a cell by a man in a grey lab coat. You're told that you can leave at any time, even though you've been paid for what is a memory test. So participants that did want to withdraw from the study, they weren't met with any empathy. You just gave them 4 prods to continue, even though you said they had the right to withdraw. The prods themselves made it appear that they couldn't continue. Please continue. The experiment requires you to continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice but to continue. That to me doesn't sound like the right to withdraw at all. Again, they were told by an authoritative figure that this was to continue, and they'd been paid, so the obligation to continue the test would have been increasingly high. The psychological harm from this could be devastating if there were one of the 65% who went all the way, and then some sources report that some weren't debriefed until months later. So what about the psychological effect that would have? As in, like, what if they questioned that? What if they was the learner? They were getting shot themselves, and that someone could have done that to them. Some of the participants were noted to be extreme stress, self-harming by digging their nails into their legs. Clearly not enjoying it. They weren't comfortable. There were 3 seizures that got reported. That to me didn't sound ethical at all. £4.50. He said it was normal practice for $4.50, but $4.50 back then could get you quite a lot. It's 14 loaves of bread or 22 beers at the time, so it's quite a lot of money for its age. And that's really all I've got for this. So,
Second speaker from the affirmative team is Ebony.
So my contribution to this debate will be defending Milgram's study covering the ethical issues. So first of all, Milgram's work was covered by the American Psychological Association, which he did gain an award from. So it obviously shows that he did meet all the ethical guidelines. Also, before he carried out his research, he did a survey to professionals such as psychiatrists, psychologists and psychology students to ask the estimate amount of people who he thought would give the shocks, and only no more than 3% said that they would go up to the 450 volts, so this shows that the results was not anticipated. He also protected his participants from harm by following up a year later, asking all the participants if they could do a psychiatric test. None of them showed that they had any long-term damage. In fact, 84% was happy that they took part, 74% learned something new, and 1.3% only said that they had negative feelings. Milgram, it can be argued that the stress that the participants felt was caused to their willingness to actually electrocute the innocent people, and shows that their responsibility was the actual realisation of that they was willing to go through with the electric shocks. Milgram was also debriefed each participant after each session. He individually spoke to the obedient participants and told them that their behaviour was actually normal, as well as the disobedient participants, and said that their behaviour was socially desirable for standing up to an authority figure. As well as the participants met the learners straight after the session, and according to the Code of Human Ethics, it quotes, expects all researchers to provide a debrief for their clients. So there was no ethical guidelines missed, and Milgram debriefed at the earliest opportunity. Milgram did give its participants the right to withdraw. It might be confused with the prompts because he was telling them to carry on. However, Milgram made it clear before the experiment that they would receive the $4.50, whether they withdrew from the experiment or not. And 35% of the participants actually withdrew, so it shows that it was possible. Despite Milgram using slight deception, the British Psychological Society states that psychological research is impossible without using a small bit of deception. In order to gain research, Milgram needed to do this to have qualitative data. The American Psychological Society quotes, "The end justifies the means. All right to deceive society is to get something out of it." This shows that the American Psychological Society even granted Milgram an award, so it shows that it was deemed ethically acceptable, and shows that they supported his experiment. Many other researchers also defend Milgram, as without using deception it wouldn't show the participants' true behaviours. Researchers still reflect on the studies, on the results that Milgram produced today. 80% of participants also agreed that took part in the study that deception should be used in other studies to reflect their true behaviours. Milgram shouldn't be penalised for what many researchers still do today, because many of the aims behind studies don't fully obtain the truth of the aim. Informed consent. Participants were aware, if Milgram gave fully informed consent, participants would be fully aware of the aim and possibly could show demand characteristics. Evidence that shows this is the researcher cannot typically seek the consent of those being observed before doing the research, since that could lead to altered behaviour. as well as an evidence that shows research requirements often make it necessary to withhold information or actively deceive participants. Therefore, if the participants was told before consenting, the experiment would have been pointless. Confidentiality. Milgram maintained confidentiality and anonymity. He kept strict records, and he also asked the participants to publish the evidence beforehand. After Milgram died, the confidentiality of the participants still remained private. Psychologists tried to ask the university for the participants' details, but these still remain private to keep their privacy rights maintained. To sum up, Milgram did follow the ethical guidelines. He debriefed, he followed up, he did the right to withdraw, he maintained confidentiality, and he protected his participants from harm at all abilities. He was also ahead of his time by putting in place these ethical guidelines, as there was no guidelines at the time to follow at this time of his experiment.
Second speaker from the opposing team is Vicky.
Okay, so the ethical implications of this study. This experiment had quite a lot of ethical implications. The first and most obvious one being that the participants, right from the start, were being deceived. Upon arriving to the university, participants were met by the experimenter, who wore a grey lab coat. They were told that the study was that of learning and memory, and this was, of course, a lie. The experiment was on obedience. Because of this deception, technically the participants were prevented from giving their informed consent. Another deception of this study was the roles of the teacher and learner. The participants believed that they were to choose straws that would determine their role of either being the teacher or the learner, but again, this is not the case. It was rigged so that the participants would always be the teacher and the experimenter's confederate always being the learner. It is also worth noting that the participants got paid just for turning up. They were given £4.50 for simply coming to the university laboratory, regardless of what might happen after. This is highly unethical because being paid or getting any kind of incentive increases the sense of obligation felt by the participant despite any objections they may have. This can be damaging to the experiment and often give false results. It can also be said that the participants were not made fully aware of their right to withdraw from the experiment. Milgram states that at any time participants were free to withdraw. However, this has a lot of debate to that, because firstly, the sense of obligation from getting paid may have made the participants feel as if they had to continue, and secondly, because of the prods and cues from the authority figure, may have made them feel as if they had no choice but to go on. Lastly, there was little protection of participants. Throughout the study, it was evident to see that the participants were suffering. Many showed signs of tension and nervousness, alongside sweating, stuttering and trembling. Other responses were digging fingernails into flesh, groaning, biting their lips and even seizures. 14 out of 40 participants commonly fell into nervous laughter fits and took the time to point out that their laughter did not mean they enjoyed shocking the learner. It is also possible that after the experiment, participants' view on themselves was shattered. Before the experiment, they may have thought of themselves incapable of doing harm to others and now could be traumatised from the reality of it. And even after the experiment, participants reported high levels of stress.
Third speaker from the affirmative team is Linda.
Okay, so does the knowledge gained about human behaviour justify the experiment? In a word, yes. Milgram's obedience experiment is widely considered to be the greatest research of its kind in social psychology. It was a breakthrough in its time, and it's still studied to this day more than 50 years later. Milgram found that people will commit acts of violence towards complete strangers just because they are told to do it by an authority figure. We also learned that cultural constraints are built into us from an early age, meaning we automatically assume authority is good and disobeying authority is bad. This was shown in the high number of people who continued to administer the shocks after the examiner told them to continue after they had protested. Milgram's experiment was very influential and taught a lot about human nature as well as obedience, which is useful in psychology today. Considering the data recorded and the reactions from participants when they were debriefed, it was undeniably a vital experiment that has continued in helping psychologists learn about human behaviour. As part of a very thorough debriefing, the participants were asked to complete a questionnaire. 92% agreed, which is a very high number. If people were harmed, it would have been a lot lower. Of those, a massive 84% said they were glad or very glad to have taken part, and 80% said they'd learned something important about themselves. Milgram admits he did deceive the participants and said that this can be morally justified for one reason only, and that is the experiment was accepted and endorsed by those who were exposed to the deception. In a quote talking about this, Milgram said, "The central moral justification was the reaction of the participants when deception was revealed. If this led to anger, discomfort or objections, the deception could have been deemed as inappropriate. The participant must be the ultimate source of judgment, not the external critic." And Sharon Stevens Brem, a retired president of the American Psychological Association, has a quote which justifies experiments such as this. "In our necessary concern with treating subjects well and protecting them from any harmful effects, we must not overlook the other side of ethical issue, the ethical imperative to gain more understanding of important areas of human behaviour. Intimate relationships can be a source of the grandest, most glorious pleasure we human beings experience. They can also be a source of terrible suffering and appalling destructiveness. It is, I believe, an inherently ethical response to try to learn how the joy can be increased and the misery reduced." Milgram's experiment has given vital information that helps psychologists understand human behaviour more and to help clients deal with various issues.
And the third speaker from the opposing team is Aisha.
Do the ends justify the means? No. For obvious reasons, it remains one of the most controversial experiments throughout history. Obeying the scientists was violating the participants' sense of morality and negatively affecting them both physically and emotionally. Participants showed severe signs of distress. Tension, nervousness, they stuttered, trembled, sweated, groaned, broke out into nervous laughing fits, and 3 people had full-blown seizures. Seizures aren't something to be taken lightly at all, and it's questionable as to why he continued with the experiment even after one person suffered something so extreme. Now, if it had just been a case of bad practice, then the ends could still justify the means. However, the findings were still very hazy. For example, the experimenter told the participants he took full responsibility. When the participants had to take responsibility for themselves, they were less likely to obey. This takes away from real-life situations, as most of the time in society people have to take responsibility for themselves. Another leading factor is that American men do not represent everyone in society, and it is a very small demographic when looking at how humans behave, because it's just such a small representation of the human race. Also, Milgram's studies were the positive ones for understanding more about human learning and memory, in contrast to the vile ideas prevalent in Nazi Germany. People in Milgram's experiment seemed in distress, as opposed to Nazis who seemed unconcerned by their actions. This makes it difficult to compare the two, as the participants thought they were doing a good thing. 2% of participants felt sorry that they had participated in the experiment. And although this still seems like such a small number, if you're looking at people and their rights, 1% should be enough to realise that that was unethical. John Darley believes we all have the capability to be evil. This evil can be actively activated by a conversion. This suggests that when we realise we are capable of our capabilities, we may be inclined to act on them. An example of this would be the Nazi doctors, who were originally normal men. However, as they progressed, they conducted awful experiments. Also, the findings were oversimplified, such as when comparing them to the Nazis in Nazi Germany. They had other motives for killing, such as promotions. And then finally, one of the participants was quoted to have said, "Good God, he's dead. Well, here we go. Well, we'll finish him." This shows someone who has become numb to the practice, which is quite alarming.
We will now have an interval so that each debate team can compose their rebuttal.